Welcome to the Off the Cuff podcast. Today we're lucky enough to be joined by the Lord Attlee. Steeped in politics from a young age due to his grandfather being the one and only Clement Attlee, Lord Attlee has been hereditary member of the House of Lords since 1992. Before he took the title though, he made it his business to have a professional career and worked in the field of commercial vehicle recovery and repair in order to ensure that any future political endeavours were grounded in operational experience. He also has military experience, having served in Bosnia, the Gulf War and Rwanda. Welcome, Lord Attlee.
Thank you.
As I said in my introduction, you've been steeped in politics all your life, so can you tell us a bit about what it's like and how it influenced you growing up?
To start with, when I turned up at my prep school, I was teased because I was a socialist. The problem was I didn't even know what a socialist was. So that was a bit of a culture shock. To be honest, I was slightly disappointed, especially with hindsight, that I had such a rough time for something that I wasn't responsible, didn't understand. I suspect what the school did was tell the other parents that I was coming, and then they preloaded their children. Children can be pretty wicked. That wasn't much fun, really. Then when I went to Stowe, they didn't care what your background was. Everyone mucked in together, so it wasn't a problem there. But I think the interesting thing about my political career is actually I didn't do any politics before I got to the House of Lords. I did no debating society, no local government. I only had an understanding of current affairs that you would expect of an ordinary person of my age. And then I suddenly found myself with a seat in the House of Lords. And do I want to take it up or do I just want to ignore it? And I took my seat. It's very advisable to claim your seat at the earliest possible date for procedural reasons. But then I actually found that I had things to offer that others didn't. And then I just built up my knowledge of current affairs.
Coming to the fact that you obviously say that you didn't have an awful lot of knowledge about current affairs before you went into the House of Lords. Obviously, he was still your grandfather, so what is your fondest memory of him?
The answer is not very much. I can remember him being a lovely old man in his house in Great Missenden. After his wife Vi died, she died unexpectedly. Clem thought that he would pass away first. He went back to London and lived in a nice flat in the Temple, where it was close to the House of Lords. People would look after him. He had a lovely life there. And when I was going on my way to school, quite often I would be picked up and have lunch with him, either in the Temple or I vaguely remember having lunch in the House of Lords. But the problem was that I had a squeaky voice and he'd had his first stroke. So I found it extremely difficult to understand what he was saying. And I think in addition, I thought that everyone's grandfather had been Prime Minister. It didn't seem to me to be anything special. And yet, actually, my grandfather was a superstar.
Absolutely. And once you left school, you trained with Smith's Industries and then went into the field of commercial vehicle recovery. So can you tell us more about that work?
I had to work out what I was going to do after school, and I never dreamt at that point that I'd have a seat in the House of Lords, even though my father was a member of the House of Lords. Every hereditary peer since 1911 never expected to take their seat in the House of Lords because we all thought that the system would be changed by the time it was our turn. So I couldn't bank on having a career in the House of Lords at all. I had to have an ordinary career in industry. I was surprised that my father, who did 5 years deep sea merchant navy, never pushed me towards the merchant navy. I was considering the armed forces, but it was a time of cutbacks, slow disarmament, and I didn't see it as a growth business. And then I eventually found Smith's Industries, which had a management training scheme. The idea was to go to university, but even then I was still a very late developer, not academically gifted, and I didn't think university was for me. Certainly it wasn't at that time. So I didn't go to university, got stuck in Smith's Industries, manufacturing things like car speedometers, marine radars and echo sounders that gave me some experience in the defense industry, a division called time controls where we made consumer time controllers and central heating controllers. So I was mainly involved in materials management, and I did that for about 10 years. But all the time I was doing TA, initially in the Royal Corps Transport up till about 1980, and then in the REME, and ultimately I did 18 years in the ranks. And actually that has proved invaluable on my work on proposing changes to the prison system, because I spent a lot of time with, frankly, working class soldiers and understand what makes them tick. I was commissioned, and then I was in charge, leading them, both in the military and, as you said, on international aid. The time I spent on commercial vehicle recovery and repair wasn't very long. It's very, very useful experience, and I learned a lot from it, both about industry, but also I learned that I didn't have the Midas touch. The best I can do is run an organisation to a budget and not overrun it. I can keep financial control. I haven't got a Midas touch.
You mentioned the fact that when you were young, you felt that there was always going to be reform before you took your seat in the Lords, and now you are the only parliamentary with HGV experience. It has come to time that Parliament are going to vote to get rid of the hereditary peers. How ridiculous is that?
The principle of hereditary peers, in my opinion, is not indefensible. I can provide a very strong defence for why you might want to continue the system. We just had question time in the Lords, and I had a bit of fun because I said something along the lines of, we got 600,000 professional HGV drivers, 400,000 heavy goods vehicles, and according to the library, I'm the only person with any practical experience of the operation of heavy goods vehicles. Why do you want to get rid of me? Which provoked a lot of amusement in the House. It's quite pleasurable actually to see the enjoyment actually of the question on the part of the Labour Party, because I've got very, very good relations with the Labour peers, and it's quite fun to see my teeth. But I would say once we got rid of the hereditary peers, everyone on the political benches will owe their place in Parliament to knowing someone within the Westminster bubble. Every single one. Whereas I got my position in the House of Lords without needing to know anyone in the Westminster bubble, and I didn't, apart from I knew one Labour peer, but that didn't matter.
So in some ways you're going from a system where there is a level of independence to one of which there is no independence at all.
And absolutely. So no one can say to me, we didn't put you here to move that particular amendment. And one of them, which they're still cross with me for doing, was proposing that we implement the Leveson reforms into press regulation. And actually, I won an amendment against the wishes of my own party, and with the help of the Labour and Lib Dem and some crossbench peers. And there aren't many people actually who've won a division against the wishes of their own party.
Coming back to your time in the army, it must have been exciting but a bit terrifying to undertake tours of Bosnia, Rwanda and work during the Gulf War. So can you give us some insight into this work and what you did whilst you were overseas?
All my adult life, I was doing the TA, now they're called the Reserves. When I came to the Lords in 92, at that young age, their lordships would expect me to go and do something other than just be in the House of Lords. So I needed to think, what am I going to do? And I decided to get into peacekeeping, peace monitoring, or something like that. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but that's the plan. And I saw an advert in the Commercial Motor for people to drive trucks in Bosnia, moving aid across the lines of confrontation. And so I went for an interview and forgot to mention that I was a commissioned officer in the TA, forgot to mention that I was a member of the House of Lords, but the chap running the organisation was a chap called Harry Orr-Paulet, later Lord Bolton, and he was a historian as well, and he knew exactly who I was. But by that route, I did a tour in Bosnia in the winter of 93-94, but I was using my military experience in order to be able to, like to think, quite skillfully operate the trucks.
And you still take quite a great interest in defence issues. So how different was combat now to how it was before?
I think it's important to understand, in terms of military operations, I have never been in contact with the enemy. I wouldn't say the same about international aid operations. There have been a few moments there. But in terms of military operations, the first military operation I did was peacekeeping in Bosnia in the winter of 97-98. And we were peacekeeping, so there was very, very little combat. The other military operation I did was Operation Telic in 2003, which was a warfighting operation at the large scale of effort. But again, my role was in a headquarters. I was a watchkeeper. I joked that my job was to answer the telephone and keep the Provost Marshal supplied with coffee. I did a bit more than that, but it wasn't my job to go and engage the enemy. So if you think I'm sort of military hero, I'm not. However, it was a warfighting operation and we were being attacked by missiles. And we thought that we were at risk of being attacked by chemical weapons. So I would say I'm one of the few people in Parliament who's donned full individual protection equipment against chemical attack.
And how has your experience of all of that time shaped your view of the world?
Disappointing to find that we were led to believe that we were going to Iraq to deal with chemical weapons. And then by about June 2003, when I came back to the Lords, I was quite clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction in militarily significant quantities in Iraq at the time we crossed the start line. I think where the military experience and the international aid experience comes into play is credibility, because as one field marshal put it, that I got mud on my boots. So I do understand what military operations are like, what's involved, the difficulties with it. When you're talking to serving officers or people running an aid operation, because I've done it myself, I've got much more credibility than someone who has never done that sort of thing. And looking at the House of Commons, I don't want to criticise them, but the fact of the matter is they haven't got that many people with military experience.
And so if you could be remembered for one thing, what would it be?
In the House of Lords?
What, in life, in the House of Lords?
I think just decency and collegiateness. I've always protected my reputation and the legacy that I have to protect. So I'm acutely aware that I must not do anything to damage the Attlee reputation or my own reputation.
And what's the most important lesson you've learned over your career?
It's one that my grandfather also adhered to, and that is never create an enemy unnecessarily. And I can give you a recent example. I got an email from a Guardian journalist, and he quoted some rather colourful things that Lord Hanson said about me in the House of Commons when he was running some sort of anti-hereditary peers bill. And he's querying why I was a Conservative and said I was the worst example of a hereditary peer. But I emailed back to him. I said, well, Lord Hanson's a great public servant. He did a great job in the House of Commons. He's doing a great job in the House of Lords, and he's perfectly entitled to use any argument he sees fit. And the journalist respected that. But then, interestingly, when he wrote his article in The Guardian, he actually used one of my points, which was when the hereditaries are gone, everyone on the political benches will owe their position in the Lords to knowing someone in the Westminster bubble. So by not being rude, by not creating an enemy unnecessarily, actually I very quickly got a win because I got a nice point made in the Guardian newspaper. Once you created an enemy, you cannot undo it. And if I had enemies in the Lords, I would never have been able to win that division against the government on press regulation because there'd have been too many people who didn't like me. Maybe they might not hold me in very high regard. That's an entirely different matter from being an enemy.
And talking about collegiate work, we've worked together on the issue of reform of the prison service, which we touched on earlier, namely the introduction of a new sentence where male prolific minor offenders are detained for training at His Majesty's pleasure, or DFT, to provide them with the skills they need to get their lives back on track. Can you tell us a bit more about how this might work?
In 2017, we had a debate about prison numbers, actually, and I decided to take a very, very close look because I suspected it left a lot to be desired, and it certainly does. About that time, Rory Stewart instigated an embryonic prison system parliamentary scheme to enable parliamentarians to have a deep look within prisons. That enabled me to spend a lot of time talking to people in Brixton Prison. So I really understood how the prison system works or doesn't work. There are lots of problems, but it struck me that the biggest opportunity was young, prolific minor offenders because they get into the cycle of offending. But good news is most of them stop offending by the time they're 26 or 30. So they're not hopeless. But what we do at the moment is we lock them up in one building. We do very little to address their weaknesses. The report from the Chief Inspector of Prisons, the Chief Inspector says that inspectors have run out of superlatives to describe how poor the purposeful component is. So my proposal is instead of using secure state and locking someone up for 12 months, my proposal is that we detain them for training and release is dependent upon achieving the required improvement levels in terms of education, training and conduct. Instead of using a secure state, we go remote rural in order to isolate from criminal influences, isolate from drugs, and most importantly, mobile phones and mobile phone signals. The initial phase would be called basic compliance training in order to instill hope, pride, and discipline in order that more interesting training can be safely undertaken later on. And the training we do later on would give them some usable trade skills so they'd be much more employable. For instance, basic first aid at work certificate, because every employer has to have a proportion of employees who are first aid trained. If you and I wanted to work on a construction site, we can't, because we need a basic construction skills certificate so that when we go on the construction site, we'll not be a danger to ourselves or anyone else. Not particularly difficult to train for, but very useful. In the prison system, they do some opportunities for forklift truck training, but why do we not give all of these youngsters the training to operate a forklift truck? Because it doesn't take very long, but it's a strong path into employment.
Yes, because reoffending is currently extremely high, so skilling, pride and hope would help to reduce these numbers.
Indeed, but the suicide rate in the prison system is 1 per week. So the first thing you need to do if you've got a training scheme is to instill the hope and then the pride and then the discipline in order that you can then take greater risks. But also when you're training them, giving them these skills, you've got to give them some fun as well. You're not going to get anywhere with these youngsters without some element of fun. So why did I do all those years as a junior soldier in the TA, being told what to do by people who weren't necessarily any cleverer than I was? The reason why I did all that was because it was fun. And you can get a lot out of youngsters if you give them a structured environment, give them leadership, an element of fun, but you also need to, I have to say, you need to be pretty strict as well.
Absolutely. And how are you going to make sure that that strictness is involved in your plan? Because some people would say that if they aren't on the secure estate, then basically you're giving them a soft option.
It certainly wouldn't be a soft option. They do not respond to punishments because they've been hurt as much as you can possibly imagine. So if you want to get them to perform, you've got to give them constant rewards every step of the way. So they start off with very, very little. And then every time they do something correct, well, they get another improvement in their circumstances. So, for instance, in the morning, obviously, they're going to have to wash. To start off with, the water is 100 meters away and it's cold. But as things progress, as they succeed, and they will succeed, the water will be nearer and nearer. And then if you'll give them the facilities to heat the water up, then you might give them the facilities to heat the water up automatically, but constant improvement in conditions. You also need to have the teams compete against each other. So the teams might have some mission that has to be accomplished, and the one that wins, they get the barbecue with beer. The one that comes runners up gets the barbecue without beer. And I say that the ones, metaphorically, the ones that lose get the pizza that's been through the blender. At the moment, we don't require any improvement in literacy and numeracy. You commit an offence, we lock them up for 12 months, but we don't say we won't release you until you achieve a measurable improvement in literacy and numeracy. But if these kids are functionally illiterate and innumerate, they are unemployable, because even if we give them a forklift truck ticket, they still can't be employed because they can't read the sign on the pallet that says, do not move this pallet because it will collapse. So they have to have functional literacy, and we can measure the improvement in the education so we can actually see that they have improved and met the requirement.
Talking of our young people, obviously times have very much changed since you and I were young. What do you think is the biggest impact on young people when it comes to them navigating their futures?
I think the biggest impact is social media. My problem is I'm 68. I don't have a smartphone. I have a Nokia. I don't do social media. I know that I am out of touch, but I really feel for the youngsters with the effect of social media, echo chambers, distorted news, not reliable sources of news. I think it must be extremely difficult for them.
And how do you think this impacts democracy?
Very adversely, because we know perfectly well that the computer systems will take you to things that you like, where you agree with the point of view. Whereas when I read The Economist carefully, I read articles where they challenge my thinking. I think, am I right in that? But if you only read things where the algorithms take you in that direction, you're not going to have a balanced view. And so that is, as we know, is extremely distorting to our economy. And that before we even consider bots.
And what do you think the world will look like in 5 years' time?
I am deeply, deeply worried about the current international situation. I'm very pleased about how the Prime Minister is managing the current international situation. I think we all are. But if we can't solve the situation satisfactorily in Ukraine, we are going to be in very, very serious difficulties because, in my opinion, we'll have to rearm. I think an awful lot of serious thinkers are thinking the same way. We never thought that we'd have to rearm. We're thinking that we maybe would be better to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence rather than 2%. But now we're looking at the prospect of rearming and looking at more like 5%, which used to be doable. But we now need to get back to 5% unless we can resolve the Ukraine-Russia situation, which I think is going to be extraordinarily difficult. The government's made really difficult decisions already about international aid, and I would support that as a short-term intervention, but it only fills the current gaps on the current defence programme, not any increases to our capability. If we have to rearm, it's not a question of wanting to rearm. I'm afraid the obvious target, the only target really, is the welfare budget, and that is going to lead to howls of pain. So I don't envy any government that's going to have to deal with that.
Looking at the positive, what gives you the most hope for the next generation?
Sometimes you hear people criticise the younger generation. I think that's always been the case. My wife's father absolutely hated rock and roll, and we think it's classic. We love Queen, you know. So I think it's an easy trap to fall into, to thinking that the younger generation is no good. They're just different. They've got different priorities to us. They think about things differently. I think they're in many ways much better educated than we were. They know how to make use of technology. I think it's all exciting, actually, provided we can get out of our current difficulties.
And with that, we come to the end of another interview. Lord Attlee, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about your political career and showing how important it is that when addressing problems, the most important thing is creating effective solutions that actually help resolve the problem. Thank you to the listeners of the podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my book Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.